There are sounds you never forget. The crack of thunder. The screech of tires. The laughter of children. But the sound that echoed through Northwood High's cafeteria that Tuesday afternoon was different. It was the sound of a soul shattering. And then, in the terrible silence that followed, it was the sound of something ancient and violent waking from a forced slumber. We were all there. Every single one of us. We saw it unfold like a car crash in slow motion, unable to look away, unable to intervene. We watched as the school's most feared bully, Jake Dalton, made the worst mistake of his life. We watched him grab the new girl, the quiet one with the haunted eyes and the military green sweater. We watched him lift her slight frame off the ground with a triumphant roar that echoed off the cafeteria walls. And we watched, frozen in our seats, as he hurled her body onto a lunch table like she was nothing more than a sack of garbage. The crash was spectacular. Trays flew through the air. Spaghetti painted the walls. Mashed potatoes exploded across the linoleum floor. And there, in the center of the chaos, lay the girl they called Scarra, broken, crying, covered in food, and utterly humiliated. We thought that was the end of it. Just another chapter in Jake Dalton's reign of terror. Another victim added to his list. Another story we'd whisper about in the hallways but never actually do anything to stop. We were catastrophically wrong. What we didn't know, what none of us could have known, was that the girl Jake had just brutalized wasn't a victim at all. She was a weapon. A trained, conditioned, government-protected weapon. And Jake Dalton, in his infinite arrogance, had just pulled the pin. What happened in the next 60 seconds would rewrite the social hierarchy of our entire school. The hunters would become the hunted. The bullies would run for their lives. And the girl we had dismissed as weak would reveal herself to be the most dangerous person in the building. But before we dive deeper into this story of revenge, transformation, and the terrible consequences of pushing someone past their breaking point, let me tell you about the world that created this moment. Northwood High School wasn't just a building. It was an ecosystem. A carefully balanced hierarchy of predators and prey, of social royalty and forgotten outcasts. The cafeteria was the beating heart of this system, a massive room that reeked of institutional food, floor cleaner, and teenage desperation. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed constantly, casting everything in a sickly yellow-white glow that made even the healthiest students look vaguely ill. The floor was a battlefield map, divided into territories as clearly defined as any medieval kingdom. The athletes owned the prime real estate by the windows, where natural sunlight fought through the grime-covered glass. The theater kids commandeered the area near the stage, their voices a constant cacophony of improvised scenes and inside jokes. The academic elite huddled near the library entrance, their tables covered in textbooks and laptops. And scattered throughout, like refugees in a war zone, were the loners, the ones who ate quickly, heads down, praying not to be noticed. At the apex of this ruthless social pyramid sat Jake Dalton and his crew. Jake was 19 years old, held back a year after academic difficulties that everyone knew had more to do with his family's money and influence than any actual learning disability. He was built like a linebacker because he was a linebacker, 6 feet of muscle wrapped in arrogance and covered by his signature outfit, baggy tan cargo pants that hung low on his hips, and a bright red varsity jacket with pristine white sleeves. The jacket was his crown, his armor, his identity. On the back, bold white letters spelled out, Northwood, above a snarling wildcat mascot. On the breast, a smaller wildcat patch marked him as team captain. He kept his light brown hair in a buzz cut, military style, which only emphasized the hard angles of his jaw and the cold calculation in his blue eyes. When Jake walked through the hallways, people moved. Not because they respected him, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. To his left, always, was Marcus, though everyone called him Brick. Brick was aptly named. He was a wall of muscle and minimal brain activity, wearing the same style of jacket as Jake but in blue and white. His cargo pants were always stained with S. Omething, grass, mud, blood from the last person who'd looked at him wrong. Brick didn't need to think. He just needed to execute Jake's commands with the efficiency of a trained attack dog. To Jake's right sat Dylan, the hyena of the group. Skinny, quick, with a face that seemed designed for smirking. His jacket was green and gold, JV team colors, and he wore it like it was the finest silk. Dylan's specialty wasn't violence. It was humiliation. He had a camera ready at all times, documenting Jake's conquests, uploading the best moments to social media where they'd rack up views and comments from students too scared to speak up in person. Together, they formed a triumvirate of cruelty that had ruled Northwood High unchallenged for 3 years. And then Ara Vesper transferred in. She appeared on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks into the fall semester, materializing in the hallway between second and third period like a ghost stepping through a wall. No announcement. No introduction from a teacher walking her around. Just suddenly there, standing at a locker that had been empty the day before, moving with mechanical precision as she loaded textbooks into the dented metal space. Ara was 19, like Jake, but everything about her suggested someone much older. Or perhaps someone who had never been young at all. She stood about 5'6", with a slight build that made her look almost fragile. Her long brown hair hung straight and lifeless, always positioned to fall across the left side of her face, creating a curtain that partially obscured the thin, silvery scar that ran from her eyebrow down to her cheekbone. The scar caught the light sometimes, reflecting it back like a crack in porcelain. Her wardrobe never changed, military green sweaters that looked 2 sizes too big, faded blue jeans with worn knees, and scuffed combat boots that had clearly seen better days. It wasn't a style choice. It was camouflage. An attempt to blend into the background, to become invisible in a place where standing out could get you killed, or at least humiliated, which to a teenager was often the same thing. But it was her eyes that truly unsettled people. They were a pale, stormy gray, the color of winter clouds or gunmetal. They never seemed to focus on what was directly in front of her. Instead, they looked through you, past you, at something 1,000 miles away or 1,000 years ago. When teachers called on her in class, she would startle slightly, as if being yanked back from somewhere else entirely. The rumors started immediately, as they always do with transfer students who don't fit the mold. "She's in witness protection," whispered Sarah Chin during lunch on that first day. "Her whole family got killed by the mob." "I heard she burned down her last school," countered Brett Morrison, his eyes wide with the thrill of gossip. "That's why she got expelled." "No, no, no," insisted Veronica Hall, leaning in conspiratorially. "My mom works at the district office. She said Ara's parents died in a house fire, and she's the only survivor. That's where she got the scar." The theories multiplied with each passing day, growing more elaborate and dramatic. But Ara never confirmed or denied anything. When people asked about the scar, and there was always someone tactless enough to ask, her answer was always the same, a barely audible "I fell," delivered in a monotone that made it clear the conversation was over. The truth was, we didn't want to know the real story. We wanted her to be whatever archetype made us feel comfortable. The tragic orphan. The dangerous delinquent. The mysterious transfer student. As long as she stayed in her box, as long as she stayed quiet and invisible at her lonely table near the trash cans, she was safe. Jake Dalton had other plans. Hey, if you're enjoying this story and want to see more content like this, real stories about hidden strength, shocking transformations, and the consequences of pushing people too far, make sure to subscribe to the Bully Tales. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Trust me, what happens next in this story is something you absolutely need to see. Now, let's get back to the moment everything changed. For Jake, Ara Vesper was an opportunity. She represented everything he loved in a target: isolated, vulnerable, visibly damaged. She didn't have friends to defend her. She didn't have a posse to back her up. She was alone, which in Jake's world meant she was fair game. It started small, as these things always do. A shoulder check in the hallway that sent her stumbling into the lockers. "Whoop, didn't see you there, Scare," Jake would say, his voice dripping with false apology while his friends laughed. Kicking her backpack as he walked by, sending her belongings scattering across the floor. Making kissing noises when she walked past, followed by exaggerated retching sounds. "Dude, I can't even look at that face without wanting to puke," he'd announce loudly enough for everyone, including Ara, to hear. She never reacted. Never fought back. Never reported him. She would simply collect her scattered belongings with mechanical efficiency, her expression never changing, her pale gray eyes never meeting anyone's gaze. To Jake, this made her the perfect victim. To the rest of us, it made her invisible. We were all guilty. Every single one of us who watched and did nothing. Who laughed revowsly at Jake's jokes to avoid becoming targets ourselves. Who looked away when Ara ate alone. Who perpetuated the nickname Scary because it was easier than learning her real name. We told ourselves it wasn't our problem. That she probably preferred being alone. That if it really bothered her, she would say something. We were wrong about everything. The day it all exploded started like any other Tuesday. Classes dragged. The weather was gray and oppressive, the kind of late October day that made you want to crawl back into bed. Third period, Jake got his history test back, a fat red F circled at the top, with a note from Mr. Patterson suggesting he come in for tutoring. The test landed on Jake's desk like a grenade. His jaw clenched. His knuckles went white as he crumpled the paper into a ball. Brick and Dylan exchanged glances. They'd seen this before. When Jake's ego took a hit, someone else would pay the price. It was as predictable as gravity. By the time lunch period rolled around, Jake was a coiled spring of rage and humiliation. He needed to reassert his dominance, to feel powerful again. And he knew exactly where to find that feeling. The cafeteria was at maximum capacity, over 300 students packed into a space designed for 250. The noise level was deafening: conversations, laughter, the clatter of trays, the beeping of the cash registers, the industrial hum of the vending machines. The air was thick with competing smells: greasy pizza, overcooked vegetables, the sickly sweet scent of fruit punch, and the underlying chemical smell of industrial cleaning products. Ara Vesper sat at her usual table, a small, isolated two-person setup near the swinging kitchen doors and the overflowing trash bins. It was the worst real estate in the cafeteria, where the smell of garbage mixed with the heat from the kitchens to create an almost unbearable atmosphere. But it was the only place where she could eat without someone demanding she move or making comments about her appearance. She wasn't eating. She never really ate. Instead, she was performing a slow, methodical dissection of her mashed potatoes with a white plastic fork, creating small trenches and valleys in the beige mass. Her chocolate milk sat unopened. Her apple sat untouched. Her eyes were far away, looking at something none of us could see. From his throne by the windows, Jake watched her. His friends were laughing about something Brick had said, but Jake wasn't listening. His focus had narrowed to a laser point on that solitary figure in the military green sweater. "I'm bored," he announced suddenly, cutting through the laughter. His voice had an edge to it that made Dylan and Brick immediately stop talking. "Think Scare's lonely over there? Maybe we should keep her company." The scrape of Jake's chair against the linoleum floor might as well have been a starter pistol. A ripple of awareness spread through the cafeteria. Conversations die. Mid-sentence. Heads turned. We all knew what was coming. Some of us had the decency to look uncomfortable. Most of us just watched, grateful it wasn't us, hating ourselves for that gratitude. Jake approached her table with the confident swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences. His red and white varsity jacket caught the fluorescent lights, making him look like a predator in bright plumage. Brick and Dylan flanked him, their colored jackets creating a wall of varsity letters and cruel intention. "Hey there, Scare," Jake drawled, his voice loud enough to carry to the nearby tables. His shadow fell across Ara and her tray, engulfing her in darkness. "That lunch looks pretty sad. Kind of matches your whole vibe, doesn't it?" Ara didn't move. Didn't look up. Her fork remained poised over the mashed potatoes, trembling slightly but not moving. The lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Jake. His smile tightened into something uglier. He leaned down, placing both hands on her table, bringing his face close to hers. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too stupid to respond?" Still nothing. Ara remained frozen, a statue of forced calm. But if you looked closely, and I was looking, we were all looking, you could see the tiny tells. The way her knuckles whitened on the fork. The way her breathing had become shallow and rapid. The way her left hand, hidden partially under the table, had curled into a fist so tight her fingernails dug crescents into her palm. "You know what I think?" Jake straightened up, addressing the audience we had become. "I think Scare here thinks she's too good for us. Sits here all alone, doesn't talk to anyone, won't even look at people. It's rude, right? Somebody should teach her some manners." He kicked the leg of her table. The metal screeched. The impact sent vibrations through the surface, causing her chocolate milk carton to wobble dangerously. On the third kick, it toppled, falling on its side. Brown liquid gushed across the table, creating a river that flowed toward Ara's lap. She flinched. Just slightly. Just enough. And that's when we saw it. A single tear, perfect and crystalline, welled up in her right eye. It trembled on her lash line for a moment, catching the harsh fluorescent light, before breaking free and tracing a slow path down her cheek. It was careful to avoid the ridge of her scar, as if even her tears had learned to navigate around old wounds. For most of us, that tear would have inspired sympathy. Maybe even action. But for Jake Dalton, it was blood in the water. "Oh my God," he laughed, the sound harsh and mirthless. "Are you seriously crying right now? Over spilled milk?" He looked back at Brick and Dylan, who were laughing on cue. "That's pathetic. You're pathetic, Scare." He leaned down again, his face inches from hers. "Look at me when I'm Tal. King to you," he commanded. When she didn't respond, his voice rose to a shout that cut through every conversation in the cafeteria. "I said look at me." The entire room fell silent. Even the lunch ladies stopped what they were doing. 300 students held their breath. Jake's hands shot out, grabbing the collar of Ara's military green sweater. His knuckles brushed against her throat as he twisted the fabric in his grip. With a violent jerk, he yanked her out of her chair. Ara was lighter than he expected, only about 120 pounds. She came up with a small, shocked gasp, her feet leaving the ground. For one terrible, eternal second, Jake held her there, suspended in the air like a rag doll. The look on his face was pure triumph. The look on hers was something else entirely, shock, fear, and something deeper. Something breaking. "This is where you belong," Jake snarled. He took 2 heavy steps toward the adjacent table where a group of wide-eyed sophomore boys sat frozen with forks halfway to their mouths. And then he threw her. Time seemed to fracture. Everything moved in slow motion and too fast all at once. Ara's body sailed through the air in a grotesque arc, her arms and legs flailing uselessly, her long brown hair streaming behind her like a banner. She hit the table back first with a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life, a heavy, wet thunk of body meeting hard plastic. The table erupted in chaos. Trays flew in every direction. A plate of spaghetti and meatballs exploded on impact, painting Ara's sweater with crimson sauce that looked disturbingly like blood. Green beans scattered like shrapnel. Mashed potatoes splattered across the floor. A chocolate milk carton exploded against the nearby wall, brown liquid dripping down like something from a crime scene. A half-eaten pizza slid off the table and landed face down on the linoleum with a wet slap. Ara lay there, spread-eagled on the table, half buried in food. Spaghetti sauce covered her sweater and face. Mashed potatoes were matted in her hair. Her chest hitched with silent, ragged sobs. Tears poured down her face, carving clean tracks through the mess on her cheeks. Her pale gray eyes were wide and unfocused, staring at the ceiling tiles as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The scar on her face stood out like a brand, livid and angry against her flushed skin. Jake stood over her, chest heaving, face flushed with exertion and adrenaline. His red and white jacket had a smear of sauce on the sleeve now, but he didn't seem to care. He pointed a trembling finger down at her broken form. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice rough and breathless. "That's where you belong. In the trash with the rest of the garbage." The cafeteria was dead silent. The only sounds were Ara's silent sobs and Jake's heavy breathing. We were all frozen, unsure what to do, unable to process what we'd just witnessed. Some of the sophomore boys at the table had backed away, pressing themselves against the wall, traumatized witnesses to violence they'd never imagined seeing in a school cafeteria. For a moment, for one brief, terrible moment, it seemed like it was over. Like Jake had won. Like Ara would just lie there in the food and the humiliation until a teacher finally intervened. But then something changed. The sobbing shifted. Deepened. What had been silent, helpless gasps transformed into something raw. Something primal. Her shoulders, which had been slack with defeat, suddenly went rigid. Her hands, splayed limply amidst the potato splatter, curled inward. Her fingers formed claws, nails digging into her palms so hard we could see drops of blood welling up. Then came the sound. It started low, a moan from somewhere deep in her chest. A sound of grief so profound it seemed to come from the earth itself. It built in her throat, gaining volume and texture, transforming from a moan into a wail into something that transcended language entirely. And then she screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain or fear. It was something else entirely. It was the sound of trauma given voice. Of memories too terrible to contain. Of a dam bursting inside a soul that had been holding back an ocean of horror. It was raw and guttural and primal, the sound of every terrible thing that had ever happened to her being forced out of her body in one long, sustained note of pure anguish. The scream went on, echoing off the cafeteria walls, seeming to shake the fluorescent lights overhead. It was a sound that didn't belong to a teenage girl. It was the sound of a soldier reliving a battlefield. Of a survivor remembering the dead. Of a weapon remembering what it was designed to do. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the scream. Slowly, so slowly it was almost mechanical, Ara pushed herself up. The movement was wrong. It wasn't the clumsy struggle of someone who'd been injured. It was smooth. Controlled. Precise. She swung her legs over the side of the table and stood in one fluid motion, landing on her feet with perfect balance. She wiped the back of her hand across her mouth, smearing spaghetti sauce across her face like war paint. Then she lifted her head and looked directly at Jake Dalton. Her eyes were different. The distant, empty gray was gone. In its place was something cold and focused and absolute. There were no more tears. There was no anger. There was nothing human left in that gaze at all. She looked at Jake the way a scientist might look at a specimen on a dissection table, with detached, clinical interest in what would happen when she started cutting. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. Her voice was flat. Emotionless. A simple statement of fact. Jake's triumph faltered. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But his ego and 3 years of unchallenged dominance wouldn't let him back down. He laughed, a nervous, brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Or what?" he challenged, puffing out his chest. "You gonna cry some more, Scarre?" Ara took a step forward. It wasn't the hesitant shuffle of a victim. It was the measured, confident step of a predator closing distance on prey. "You brought it back," she whispered, and this time there was emotion in her voice, a terrible, bottomless sorrow. "I was keeping it away. I was doing so well. But you had to push. You had to make me remember." Jake's survival instincts, dulled by years of being the apex predator, finally started screaming at him. But his pride wouldn't let him retreat. Not in front of the whole school. Not in front of Brick and Dylan. Not in front of his subjects. He decided to end this rebellion before it could begin. He threw a punch, his signature move, a wide, telegraphed right hook designed to intimidate and overwhelm. It had worked 100 times before on other people who dared to stand up to him. Ara didn't dodge. She moved. Her head tilted exactly 3 inches to the left. Jake's fist whistled past her ear close enough that her hair moved in its wake. The momentum of his own punch spun him slightly, throwing him off balance. In that fraction of a second while he was vulnerable, Ara struck. Her left hand shot upward in a movement too fast to track. It wasn't a punch. It was a precision strike. She drove the heel of her palm directly up and under his nose, a blow designed not to knock someone out but to inflict maximum pain and shock. The sound was sickening. A wet crunch of cartilage breaking. Jake's scream was high-pitched and shocked, a sound we'd never heard from him before. Blood exploded from his nostrils, gushing over his lips, down his chin, spattering across his precious red and white varsity jacket. He stumbled backward, his hands flying to his face, his eyes wide with disbelief and agony. "My nose," he shrieked, his voice nasal and wet. "She broke my fucking nose." Ara didn't respond. She stood there, perfectly balanced, her pale gray eyes locked on Jake with that same cold, clinical detachment. Waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next was Brick and Dylan. "Get her!" Jake screamed through the blood and broken cartilage. Brick roared, an actual roar, like a bear, and charged. All 230 pounds of muscle and rage, his blue and white jacket flying behind him like a cape. Dylan came from the other side, his green and gold JV colors a blur of motion, trying to flank her. The dynamic shifted in an instant. It was no longer 3 bullies against 1 victim. It was 3 targets against 1 weapon. Brick hit her first, or tried to. He lunged low, aiming to tackle her at the waist, to use his superior size and strength to bring her down. It should have worked. By every law of physics and common sense, it should have worked. Ara dropped her center of gravity, bending her knees and planting her feet. As Brick's arms wrapped around where her waist had been a moment before, she pivoted on the ball of her left foot, used his own momentum against him, hooked her right arm around his neck, and flipped him over her hip. 230 pounds of Brick sailed through the air in a perfect arc and crashed back first into a stack of blue plastic chairs 20 feet away. The chairs exploded under his weight, shattering into shards of plastic. Brick's breath left his lungs in a massive whoosh. He lay there in the wreckage, gasping like a fish out of water, unable to move. Dylan, seeing his chance while Ara was occupied, threw a wild haymaker at the side of her head. Ara's hand snapped out and caught his fist mid-flight. Her fingers wrapped around his hand like a steel trap. She twisted, a sharp, circular motion that was too fast to follow, applying leverage to his wrist, elbow, and shoulder simultaneously. There was a loud pop, the sound of a joint dislocating. Dylan's scream was piercing. His legs buckled and he dropped to his knees, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle, his shoulder wrenched out of its socket. Tears poured down his face as he cradled his useless limb. 10 seconds. Maybe 12. That's all it had taken. Brick was gasping in a pile of broken furniture, possibly with cracked ribs. Dylan was on his knees, weeping and cradling his dislocated shoulder. And Jake was standing frozen, blood pouring from his shattered nose, staring at the carnage with the dawning realization that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Ara turned her cold, empty eyes back to him. She took another step forward. With the spaghetti sauce smeared across her face like war paint, the food still clinging to her hair, and that dead, thousand-yard stare in her eyes, she looked like something that had crawled out of a nightmare. "My name," she said in that horrible, calm monotone, "isn't Scare. It's Vesper. Ara Vesper. And the last people who made me feel like this." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "They're dead now." She wasn't threatening him. She was stating a fact. A piece of historical data. And somehow that was infinitely more terrifying than any threat could have been. In that moment, Jake Dalton, the bully, the king, the boy who ruled Northwood High with fear, understood what it meant to be prey. The rational part of his brain shut down. The animal part took over. Run. He didn't help Brick. Didn't check on Dylan. Didn't try to save face or maintain his image. He just turned and ran. He fled like a rabbit from a wolf, his expensive snee. Acres slipping in a puddle of spilled gravy, almost sending him sprawling. He recovered, stumbled forward, and crashed through the double doors leading out of the cafeteria, shoving terrified students out of his way. The sight of Jake Dalton running, Jake Dalton, who had never backed down from anyone, who had made a sport of terrorizing the weak, triggered a mass panic. The spell of shocked silence broke. The cafeteria erupted into chaos. Chairs screeched as they were shoved back. Trays clattered to the floor. Students screamed and scrambled away from the epicenter, from the quiet girl who had transformed into something out of their worst nightmares. Some headed for the doors. Others pressed themselves against the walls. A few climbed onto tables, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Ara Vesper. And in the center of the chaos, Ara just stood there. The cold fury drained out of her eyes, replaced by crushing exhaustion and a sorrow so deep it seemed to physically weigh her down. She looked at her hands, at the smear of Jake's blood on her palm, at the red marks on her knuckles. She looked around at the destruction, the broken chairs, the food scattered across the floor, the injured boys crying on the linoleum. She looked at us. At the faces staring at her with terror and disgust. At the phones recording her. At the social death she had just authored for herself. She had defended herself. She had won the fight. And in doing so, she had lost everything else. She didn't run. Didn't gloat. Didn't try to explain. She simply turned and walked slowly, deliberately through the pandemonium toward the same doors Jake had fled through. She moved with a weary, tragic dignity, her shoulders slumped, her head down, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any scream. The aftermath came quickly. Someone had called 911. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Within 10 minutes, the school was on lockdown. Ambulances arrived for Brick and Dylan. Police cars surrounded the building. And the story, of course, spread like wildfire, growing more dramatic with each retelling. But the truth, when it finally emerged, was so much stranger than any rumor. It didn't come from the principal. It came from two people in dark suits who arrived in an unmarked black sedan with government plates. They flashed badges that sent the principal pale and shaking. They spoke in quiet voices behind closed doors. And slowly, through cracked doors and whispered conversations between staff members, the real story of Ara Vesper leaked out. She wasn't just from a troubled home. She was the sole surviving daughter of Marcus Vesper, the leader of a radical survivalist militia compound in rural Montana. She hadn't been raised with birthday parties and sleepovers. She'd been raised with weapons raining, hand-to-hand combat drills, and a deep-seated paranoia about government infiltration. The accident that caused her scar? It was shrapnel from the FBI raid that ended her parents' lives during a violent, bloody standoff. Ara had been 15. She'd watched her mother die. Had held her father as he bled out on the compound floor. Had been the only one to walk out alive when the tear gas cleared. She'd been placed into witness protection, given a new last name, and had bounced between 5 different schools in 3 years. Each placement had ended the same way, with some bully pushing her too far, triggering the combat conditioning that had been drilled into her since she could walk, and forcing the government to relocate her again. Northwood High had been attempt number 6. A last-ditch effort at normalization. A fragile experiment in whether a girl trained to be a soldier could ever become a normal teenager. Jake Dalton, with his petty tyranny and need to dominate, had unknowingly recreated the exact dynamics of her deepest trauma. The aggression. The public humiliation. The physical assault. He hadn't been bullying a fellow student. He'd been poking a traumatized soldier with a stick. The consequences were swift and permanent. Jake never returned to Northwood High. His family, wealthy and connected, pulled him out of school and moved to Arizona within a week. The prized red and white varsity jacket was found wadded up in a trash can behind the gym, stained with blood and abandoned like his courage. Brick's ribs healed, but he developed a stutter that appeared whenever he got stressed. He quit the football team. Dylan's shoulder eventually healed, but he would never have full range of motion again. His dreams of a baseball scholarship died with his injury. He transferred to a different school district before the semester ended. The school administration, desperate to avoid a lawsuit, instituted sweeping new anti-bullying policies, hired additional counselors, and mandated bias training for all staff. But it all felt hollow, like closing the barn door after the horse had not only escaped but had burned the barn down on its way out. As for Ara Vesper, we never saw her again. The people in suits took her away that same day. But her presence never left Northwood High. She became a legend. A ghost story we told to freshmen. A cautionary tale about hidden battles and the danger of pushing people past their breaking point. Her empty seat at the lonely table near the trash cans remained empty for the rest of the year. No one would sit there. It had become haunted ground. We had learned a brutal lesson that day. We learned that the quietest people in the room are often fighting the loudest wars. We learned that silence doesn't mean weakness, sometimes it means someone is using every ounce of their strength not to break. We learned that when you push someone past their limits, you don't get to control what comes next. Jake Dalton and his friends threw the new girl onto a lunch table thinking it was their moment of triumph. Instead, they signed their own social death warrants and discovered that the victim they had created was, in reality, a predator they had foolishly awakened. So the next time you see someone sitting alone, someone with scars they won't explain, someone who seems to be carrying weight you can't see, remember Ara Vesper. Remember that everyone is fighting a hidden battle. And remember that the person you dismiss as weak might be the strongest person in the room, quietly conserving energy for a war you know nothing about. So tell me, from which part of the country are you watching this? Share your state or city in the comments below. And let me know, what hidden strengths do you think lie within the quietest people you know? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment when someone surprised everyone by standing up for themselves? Share your stories in the comments. This is the Bully Tales, reminding you that still waters run deep, and the person you underestimate today might be the one who changes everything tomorrow.